All right, guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Maddie here, and today we're going to talk about all of the decks that have the highest win rate this season in Pokemon Pocket. We normally make this video at least once per season because I think it's really interesting information. And while average win rates are really good metrics to determine the overall viability and quality of a deck list, they're not the only thing that matters, which is why in this video we're also going to be providing extra context for those deck lists by referring to this really cool matchup data chart that I've been working on over the last few weeks. We'll talk about that later in the video. Anyway, guys, before we get into this, though, I do want to talk about the one bit of news that we did get today. If you watched yesterday's video, you do know that we were speculating that we would get the announcement trailer video for the next mini set to release on the 28th. We talked about all of that in yesterday's news update video. And we did not get the trailer today, coincidentally, but we did get this right here, which is a really interesting sort of, I guess, post or I guess just bit of information that was uploaded, I guess, and then taken down the App Store about this new update coming. So it has been confirmed. The release date is confirmed to be the 28th. We just don't have the trailer yet. It's probably coming tomorrow, if not sometime this weekend. I just can't imagine them waiting until next week, but here it is, guys. It's the new mini set here. Right here, we see the new booster pack will be available again on the 28th. This right here is going to be a set focused around seemingly the legendary beasts or dogs, whatever you call them, Suicune, Entei, and then Raikou or Raikou. People laugh at how I pronounce it. I call it Raikou. We also see Milotic here and some Poliwags, and then I think this is Skiploom or whatever the middle evolution is. A really cool image. This image is absolutely incredible. As we see, so Raikou, Entei, and Suicune are all getting EX forms, but there's also Latios and Latios, which are coming to the set. Very interesting. This art looks incredible. I'm really excited to talk about these cards once we actually get them shown, but we just don't have them yet. So everything, I guess, has been confirmed other than the actual trailer, which we thought was coming today because it's a week from set release, but I guess that's going to be coming probably tomorrow. We'll have to just wait and see. I wanted to show this to you guys because this isn't something that we had yesterday. Anyway, super excited for this. Comment down below what you guys are excited for. I love all of these Pokemon, and I think this art looks absolutely incredible. I mean, like, the vibes here are completely immaculate. So there it is. I just wanted to get that out of the way. Let's go into the deck lists, and then again, we'll refer to that cool matchup sheet, which we have, and you guys have, I guess, access to as well. Again, we'll get into it. So the first thing that we're going to take a look at here is on the Limitless page. You can actually categorize all of the decks throughout this entire season, and you can categorize them by win rate. So right here, we have a total of 77 tournaments this season, over 8,000 players, and 21,000 matches total, which is a pretty large sample size. We're into this third week of this A4 season, and these right here are the decks with the highest win rates, which is really interesting. So a couple of key points to point out here is that these are all sorted by average win rate, as we see here on the far right, but this number here on the 12th is, or on the far left here, where as we see Arceus and Pikachu here, it says 12. That means it's the 12th most played deck. And here we see the count. So this is the total, I guess, amount of players that have played this deck, and then their total meta share and their total records. So again, some of these are going to be small sample sizes, so the data matters a little bit less. But for decks like Espeon, Sylveon, which is the second most played deck, Buzzwole, Giratina, Darkrai, these are all some of the most played decks. So, you kind of have to balance between their meta share and their win rates, right? Because small sample sizes, of course, the data is just sort of less valuable. But anyway, let's hop right into it. So yes, the number one most highest win rate deck, rather, this season is Arceus EX and Pichu. So this is what we are calling Turbo Arceus, or what I call Turbo Arceus. And it really has exploded in popularity this past week. It is the 12th most played deck already of this format, and it does have a 55% win rate. So currently, right now, as it stands, the highest win rate so far, 2% of the meta share, 521 to 415. Let's take a look at an example deck list, and we'll talk about this a little bit. This is something that we've, again, showcased quite some time now. It's really interesting because when baby Pokemon in A4 had just been revealed, and we saw things like Pikachu, this was literally, honestly, I'm not like tooting my own horn here. This was one of like the first decks that I sort of built in like the deck builder before the cards were officially released. It just made a lot of sense to me that things like Arceus, when paired with Zeraora and Pichu, allow it to use that ultimate force attack as early and consistently as possible, and Oricorio just fits really well into this deck deck list. What we'll see if we go back to this this chart, or I guess, you know, the win rates, is that a lot of these decks at the top are Oricorio decks to some degree, these lightning type decks, and I think that that's really no surprise. Oricorio is a card that just wins games, and it's something that not like that many people love to play. In ranked battles, it can slow down the games a bit, so it's not super popular, but this is all tournament data, and Oricorio is always a really, really strong tournament deck, and Turbo Arceus has really emerged as kind of the best or the #1 option for these sort of Oricorio lightning type, you know, fast-paced, aggressive deck list. So here's one example of it, a really, really strong deck list. But what we can do here, again, under consideration that the 12th most played deck here, Turbo Arceus, is the highest win rate deck, we can provide additional context by going over to our matchup data chart, which I did build and I've been working on this over the last few weeks. This is actually available to anybody that is in the Discord server. This is basically all of the data from Limitless, all of the matchup data put into this chart that makes it at least somewhat easier to read. At least that's the hope, right? So we read this thing left to right. I have all of the most played decks in the format here, their total meta shares, and then all of their win rates against all of the other most common decks in the game. So let's go ahead and scroll down all the way to the bottom here because we're reading left to right. And down here is going to be Turbo Arceus, Arceus and Pichu here, all the way the second to the bottom. So can we scroll up here to try to get, well, I guess we can't, can I zoom this out actually so we can see? It might be hard to see this, but I didn't plan on this actually happening here. Can we see everything at once? I guess we can't, but anyway, if there was a way for us to see the top at the same time, we'll have to scroll and we'll have to bounce back and forth just because this is a bit long. But anyway, Arceus and Pichu has a 42% win rate, or no, we got to go down right here, has a 34 and a 33% win rate against Giratina, Darkrai, and Buzzwole. So that's interesting, right? Against two of some of the best decks in the game, it actually has a losing win rate. But as we see here, very good win rates in the next three, 65, 68, and 78. Those are really good win rates against Silvally and Zeraora, Sylveon and Greninja, and Flareon and Leafeon. So against these three matchups, Turbo Arceus seems to be doing really quite well. And then a couple of bad matchups, 32% and 44%. And if we scroll up, that is Espeon and against Arceus and Tapu Koko, which is technically a different archetype. So in that matchup, it might struggle. But then, again, another really good run against a bunch of different decks, 77%, 72%, 80%. I can highlight this this row right here is what we're looking at, and 79%. These are all going to be against things like Crobat, Guzzlord, and Ho-Oh and Charizard, which is, again, really interesting information. And I think that really what it tells me is that this sort of Turbo Arceus or Oricorio deck is really strong against some of the decks that you're probably going to end up playing. This is a very volatile matchup spread, right? There's not a lot of, I guess, yellow or light green or orange. It's a lot of dark red and dark green, which means, again, very volatile matchup spread, really strong against some decks, but really weak against other deck lists. And as we go down here, we see that 77% here is against Ho-Oh and Lugia, and then it struggles here in the next few matchups against Donphan, Silvally, Pichu, as well as having about a 50% win rate against Turbo Flareon. So really interesting matchups there for that data. I didn't plan on that being so hard to, I guess, see because of how, I guess, deep this chart is. I can't actually fit it all on one page. But anyway, guys, Turbo Arceus, really high win rate. Those are the matchup spreads, which is pretty cool. Next up is going to be Espeon and Sylveon. So Espeon and Sylveon is the second most played deck of this format, but it's also the second highest win rate, which is very impressive. It's almost 8% of the meta share right now, 1,954 to 1,576. 54.32% win rate. I've been calling Espeon and Sylveon the best deck in the format for quite some time now over the last few weeks, and I still believe that. Let's take a look at one more recent example if we can go down here. Here's a more recent deck list. There's so many different ways that people are building this deck, and I think all those little different sort of minute changes that you see across all of these Espeon, Sylveon decks do sort of change how the deck plays, but realistically not that much. I would say that as long as you're playing sort of this core of the deck, which to here, or here, I guess in this example, is a more simplified version, right? We're only not playing the small Sylveon. We're not playing the non-EX Espeon. We're playing red here. We're not playing Mars or Silver, but we do have a red card. We've got 2 EV bags, 1 giant cape. Certain changes to, you know, the trainer cards and like playing 1 EV bag or 2 giant capes, like that's going to change the deck a little bit, and it might help you in some specific matchups that you might be finding yourself playing against more often, but 95% of your games are going to function the same based around just the core of the deck being the same. So, you know, I wouldn't spend too much time. I think that take like just an example of Espeon and Sylveon, play a bunch of games, and then if you feel like, you know what, I actually feel like I would rather play 2 giant cape than, you know, cut something for giant cape, right? Those small changes really come from just playing the deck a bunch. But quickly, let's take a look at the matchup spreads right here for Espeon and Sylveon, which honestly is quite impressive when you take a look at this this matchup data, right? Now we can actually see everything all at once, which is going to make things a lot nicer. So 42% win rate against Giratina Darkrai. That is always a matchup that, you know, isn't great for Espeon, but it's actually not that bad. 42% really isn't terrible. 68% against Buzzwole, 58% against Silvally Zeraora, 80% almost against Sylveon and Greninja, 45% against Flareon, so that's not another, I guess, not great matchup. But against Arceus Tapu Koko, that's 70%. Against Crobat, 52%, which is really interesting because you would think that Crobat would be a bit of a hard counter to Espeon, but no, it's actually technically a winning matchup for Espeon, which is crazy at 52%. 32% against Guzzlord. That's definitely going to be sort of the toughest thing for Espeon is that Guzzlord matchup. I think we definitely knew that. 46% against Ho-Oh Snorlax, 52% against Charizard, and then 56, 77, 92, 58, 65, all positive matchups here against things like Umbreon, Lugia, Donphan, and then the Silvally decks, and even Turbo Arceus. We have a 65% win rate against, and then 37% against Flareon. So the decks and I guess the cards that are strong against Espeon seemingly are, of course, Giratina and Darkrai, Guzzlord, but then also the Flareon decks. Flareon seemingly has a pretty good matchup into Espeon, not terrible for Espeon, but other than that, everything else is really positive and actually really decent. So this is what I would call like a very non-volatile matchup spread, just very decent across the board. Only a couple really bad matchups and everything else is either really positive or pretty 50-50. And I think that's a big reason why Espeon is such a strong deck list. And I find that to be really interesting in general. And I think that this matchup chart really helps us, I guess, you know, have a little bit more of, I guess, a more in-depth understanding of like why a certain deck might be good. And it's really interesting to contrast the matchup spreads versus their like total win rates, you know what I mean? Because it doesn't really tell the whole story. Sometimes like decks like Turbo Arceus, as we just saw, is actually really bad against some of the other most played decks, but is really good against sort of the rest of the format. And that sort of understanding is actually really interesting. Again, this matchup spread chart here is in the Discord, and link is to the Discord will be down in the description below. So definitely go check that out. This is free. It's there for anybody in the Discord. I'm probably going to update this like every other week with all of the most recent data. So yeah, there we go. Okay, so next up on the list, if we go back, is actually going to be like Pikachu and Pichu, right? But what's interesting is this is the 48th most played deck, right? So there's only been 21 players that have played this deck, and its total record is 70 and 57, and that's a 54.26% win rate. So a very small sample size here for Pikachu and Pichu, but I do really like some of these deck lists. Let's take a look at an example. Not something that I have on the matchup chart just because it's not something that's commonly played, but this is going to be basically Pikachu Toolbox, Lightning Toolbox, just another really cool way to play Lightning Pokemon, which are so strong in the format right now. This deck is playing a lot of one-ofs, right? But we are playing that core package, right? That we're seeing across a lot of different decks, whether it's Silvally or Arceus, or I guess this Pikachu deck. It is 2 Pichu, 2 Oricorio, 2 Zeraora with 2 Energy Switch. And I think that's just a really strong combo here. It's a really strong core. Oricorio is going to win you a lot of games, but we also have both the Shining Revelry Pikachu and the Genetic Apex Pikachu, which are really strong cards actually in this format for different reasons. They both have low amount of HP. Genetic Apex Pikachu is really fast-paced and aggressive, and then of course this other Pikachu EX with Thunderbolt can do 150, and that's a lot of damage. We also have Raikou here, which is going to probably help us against other Oricorio matchups, which is again really valuable and a really cool card. So I like Pikachu a lot. Again, we don't have like the matchup spreads for it just because it's such a small sample deck that individual data probably isn't super useful, but it's just cool to see like something like this. Like it does have a lot of success early on, or I guess so far this season, even though the sample size is so small here. Again, the third highest win rate deck technically is Genetic Apex Pikachu Toolbox, which is really cool. And then here at the 40th most played deck, but the 4th highest win rate is actually something I'm seeing a lot more commonly recently, which is actually going to be Silvally with Arceus, right? So this sort of lightning type package has been split between Silvally decks and Arceus decks most prominently. And as we can see, right, so Arceus is up here, Silvally is down here, but this deck list actually plays both of them, and I find that to be really interesting. Small sample size, again, 82 and 68, 53.5% win rate, and this deck list is actually really cool. So here's a more recent example. In fact, all of these results are just in like the past few days. So this deck list has been popping off recently, and it's literally just a Turbo Arceus and Turbo Turbo Silvally combined. We're playing 2 baby Pokemon here. They're playing a Magby and a Pichu, but it really doesn't matter. You could just play 2 copies of either of them because we're playing, you know, it doesn't matter what energy we're playing. I guess we're playing Lightning Energy, so I don't know why we would actually play Magby, quite honestly. We probably should just play 2 Pikachu. I don't really know why we would choose to play Magby in the deck, but either way, it really shouldn't matter. 1 Oricorio and then, yes, 1 Arceus, right? So it's just a mix between both of sort of the turbo baby Pokemon like Oricorio archetypes, like with Silvally or Arceus. A really fun deck, a really cool deck list. And again, it does kind of just make sense, right? Again, it makes sense also that this hasn't seen a ton of play just because it makes, like, it's common knowledge that, like, you just would rather probably choose to play either Silvally or Arceus, and not many people are, I guess, choosing to put them together, but baby Pokemon have found their way into this sort of turbo colorless archetype between Silvally and Arceus really well this season. In fact, I would say it's probably the #1 example of baby Pokemon. Flareon is also doing really well with Magby, but these are definitely, I guess, the most clear examples, and of course the Ho-Oh decks, and maybe the Dragonite decks as well, but yeah, really cool deck. And a pretty high win rate. I mean, so far, again, not a big sample size, 82 and 68, but it's doing well. And the players that have played it, 28 total players have played it there so far this season. So 5th on our list is going to be Turbo Silvally, right? So much lightning in this top of this list here. But what that tells me is that Oricorio just wins games, and that's just the reality of it. Oricorio is still one of the most dominant, most impressive Pokemon in the entire game. Silvally Pichu here, the 10th most played deck of the format. We're calling this Turbo Silvally, and this has the is the 5th highest win rate, 53.5%, 200 total people playing it, 580 to 484. Definitely really impressive. Let's take a look at an example deck list, which is, again, going to be really similar. We've talked about this deck before, very similar to Arceus and Pichu and Oricorio. It's basically the same deck, but instead of Arceus, we're playing Silvally and we're playing Gladion. It does have certain strengths that Arceus doesn't, of course, being a purely single price archetype. Leading off with type Null is a bit more consistent than leading off with Arceus, that's for sure. But what's different about this deck is that because we're playing a stage 2 Pokemon, or stage 1 rather, that requires 4 total Pokemon and Gladion, we don't have room to play 2 Zeraora and Energy Switch, which, or Elemental Switch, which just makes more sense for Silvally for us to just play Pichu and Oricorio. So that's kind of what we see here. We don't have sort of the tandem combination of Pichu and Zeraora, which really does make Arceus feel a little bit more of like a turbo archetype, but this is still a really strong deck. Pichu can power up Silvally on that turns where you're going first. And Silvally traditionally is a really strong Pokemon going second, but going first, it does feel kind of bad. Pichu really does solve that, which is pretty cool. And let's take a look here at the matchup spreads, right, for Silvally and Pichu. Technically different, as we see here, than Arceus and Pichu and Silvally and Zeraora. It's going to be all the way down here. Right here is the split. So we'll have to, again, scroll up a little bit, but 42%, 42%, 44%. So against Giratina, Darkrai, Buzzwole, and Silvally Zeraora, it actually does have a little bit of a losing matchup there, right? Nothing too crazy, but nothing super positive, right? So it struggles in those matchups. 30% here against Sylveon and Greninja, so that is not a good matchup against 4 of the most common decks of the format. We are struggling, but look at all these matchups down here, right? Very, very volatile. 42% against Sylveon and Espeon, so it's even struggling in that matchup, but 92% here against Arceus and Tapu Koko, which is crazy. 64% here against Crobat, 34% against Guzzlord, so that is going to be a tough matchup, probably because of Naganadel, and then 81 and 68% against Ho-Oh and Charizard. And then if we go over here, these are sort of non-applicable matchups. These are just matchups that we didn't have enough data. That's, I guess, one thing I'll say. The spaces here that say NA, we just didn't have enough data to really put a win rate there. But 57 against Turbo Arceus, right? So technically speaking, like, Turbo Silvally actually does win the head-to-head against Turbo Arceus, which is really interesting. And then a losing matchup against Flareon and Magby, which is also kind of interesting if you think about that. But I guess they do play the Genetic Apex Flareon, so maybe that does make sense because that Flareon kind of rolls through Silvally. But yeah, very, very volatile matchup spread here, which is, again, like the more intricate data when we kind of get past the overall win rate is really interesting. This right here being like the 4th or 5th highest win rate deck, but has a really volatile matchup spread is just really interesting, and it kind of tells that whole story, and I think that's definitely really cool. So yeah, where was it here? Over here? Yeah, sorry, Silvally, Pichu, and Oricorio. A really good deck list. Honestly, I think overall right now I would prefer Arceus, but this data, again, just really cool. One of the highest win rate decks in the entire game. But I'm not really surprised by that, if we're being honest with you. Now, let's get into some non-Oricorio decks, because there's just a lot of them. Next up is going to be Buzzwole. The premier Buzzwole archetype this format was Buzzwole and Pheromosa, but we do see Buzzwole Celesteela down here as well. Buzzwole Pheromosa, the third most played deck of this format, and it's the fifth, or I guess the sixth, no, yeah, sixth highest win rate, right? Yeah, sixth highest win rate. I can't count so far this season. 53.37%, 6% of the meta share, 1,500 to 58 to 1,309. So a very impressive season so far for Buzzwole, and it's right in front of Guzzlord, which is funny that the Ultra Beast decks are both so strong. Let's take a look at a recent Buzzwole deck example, which is going to be playing 2 Pheromosa, 2 Buzzwole, 2 Celesteela, and then 2 Cyrus, 2 Lily, 2 Ericas, a Guzma, and a Repel, which is cool. So we're not actually playing Sabrina, we're actually playing Repel, which, again, I actually always loved Repel in Buzzwole, so cool to see the return. No Rocky Helmet here, but 2 Leaf Capes. I like Buzzwole a lot. In fact, I would say that Buzzwole really is that sort of third best deck so far this season, and it's something that I've never put into S tier, but I've been really close to putting it into S tier week after week after week. The matchup spreads are going to be really interesting for Buzzwole, I think, and I think it'll provide some interesting data. So let's go up here. Buzzwole right here, this sort of second deck here on the list. A 58% win rate against Giratina Darkrai, certainly a good matchup, and then a 61% win rate against Silvally Zero Aura. So against two of some of the most common decks, winning matchups, 50-50 basically against Sylveon and Greninja. Really bad matchups though against Flareon, Leafeon, and Espeon. Very interesting indeed. 47% against Arceus and Tapu Koko. That is pretty 50-50. Nothing too terrible, but 58% win rate against the dark type decks like Crobat and Guzzlord. Really bad against the fire decks like Ho-Oh and Charizard. Again, that all makes sense. And then actually really decent matchup spreads across the board here up until you get to Flareon, which that's a 44% win rate. So basically what that tells me is that Buzzwole does really well against basically everything that's not fire type or Espeon. Those teams, I guess, is like sort of the only things that are, I guess, holding Buzzwole back. And Charizard, you know, it is a common deck right now in the format, but it's not necessarily like a dominant deck in the format. So this matchup, same with Ho-Oh, like these aren't like super common decks. Flareon is on the rise for sure. There are quite a few Flareon decks, but Espeon really the only thing I think right now really holding back Buzzwole from being a super top tier archetype. Yeah, I just think that data is so interesting. You know, the matchup spreads for Buzzwole here, really cool. It's actually pretty balanced across the board, right? It's a couple good, couple bad, but pretty balanced really everywhere, which I find to be very interesting for Buzzwole. So shout out to Buzzwole Pheromosa, one of the best decks in the entire game. I have it like third right now on our power rankings, but yeah, definitely really cool. Comment down below if you're surprised about any of this data. And again, go to the Discord, check out the link, and then get this matchup chart for yourself, because whether you're playing in tournaments or you're choosing decks for ranked mode, this is going to be a really good example for you. Basically, you can work backwards, find a deck list that you've been going up against a lot, like up here, and then scroll down and try to find a deck that, you know, has a really good win rate against it, and maybe you can choose that deck list, right? So anyway, there we go. Next up is Guzzlord. So I think like a week ago, I made a video saying like Guzzlord and Naganadel was like the highest win rate deck, because it did. Like in that counter meta, like week 2 time period, Guzzlord really soared up and was actually the highest win rate deck in the entire season. It went above Espeon and Sylveon, and it was like almost a 56% win rate, but then it's gone down actually pretty drastically since then. Currently, it's the the 5th most played deck, but the 7th highest win rate so far. 53.36% win rate, 1,033 to 864, and 4% of the meta share. That's the record. Let's take a look at an example of Guzzlord, and we'll talk a little bit about its matchup spreads and why I think it probably has fallen off a little bit as we sort of exited the counter meta period of the season, and we came into week 3. But most people right now are still playing 2 Naganadel, 2 Nihilego, 2 Guzzlord. That is sort of the poison aggro package. Naganadel, in my mind, really carried Guzzlord this season with all of the baby Pokemon, and just in general, a lot of Oricorio kind of flying around. Like Naganadel's pace and its damage was actually really relevant, and Guzzlord in general actually was a pretty good like late game sweeper Pokemon, with Lusamine able to get those 4 energies onto Guzzlord. And you know, Guzzlord having a really strong matchup into Espeon this season really did carry it, especially through that second week, but things started to balance out a bit, and Guzzlord has fallen off a bit slightly now. But this sort of poison aggro Guzzlord Dark Ultra Beast deck, whatever you want to call it, really strong, and one of my favorite decks so far this season. But let's take a look at the matchup spread. So right here is Guzzlord's row. So 44% against Giratina Darkrai, right? So nothing too great. And 39% against Buzzwole. Also not that great, but 65% win rate against Silvally Zero Aura. and 50% against Sylveon and Greninja, 57% against Flareon, Leafeon, and 66% against Espeon, 68% against Arceus, Tapu Koko, and 58% against Crobat, right? So other than, Buzzwole and Giratina Darkrai, like Guzzlord was really well positioned for all of the other most played decks of the format. And here, as we see against Ho-Oh and Snorlax, 43%, but a bunch of really good matchups here against Charizard, Umbreon, Ho-Oh, Lugia, and Donphan, and even Silvally and Pichu. So that's really, really cool. However, against Arceus and Pichu, it's a much worse matchup. So that's a really interesting thing about Guzzlord. Arceus really rose in play coming into this third week. It became very popular. In fact, it's actually been seeing more play recently than Silvally has, right? And for Guzzlord to have a really good matchup into Silvally, but a really bad matchup into Arceus is a really strange thing. Like, you just would never think that, but I think that's also a pretty large contributor to why Guzzlord maybe has fallen off a little bit in these upcoming weeks. Things like Buzzwole, Giratina Darkrai, and Arceus are all becoming increasingly popular, and those are decks that are, in general, just really strong against Guzzlord. So this matchup spread here is very, very impressive. A couple of really bad matchups, but across the board, almost really, really great, right? As long as you're not playing Giratina Darkrai, Buzzwole, and Arceus, like, you're doing really well. Like, honestly, you kind of have a positive win rate into everything else, and I think that's definitely a really cool thing about Guzzlord. I guess it really does showcase that it was kind of the top counter meta deck in the format right now, doing well against Silvally and Espeon. Definitely really, really cool for sure. Shout out to Guzzlord, Naganadel, one of the most volatile decks so far this season. Just absolutely insane. As an Espeon player, I hated this thing for sure. And then when I made a video about it and tried to play it, I got beaten in the mirror match like 5 times. So that's what we get for sure, right? Next up here, we've got Giratina and Darkrai. We'll wrap up this video a little bit because we could just continue on and on and on, but you guys get the idea. So Giratina Darkrai is actually, what is this, the 8th most highest win rate deck so far this season, but it's the #1 most played deck. And what we always say is that when a deck is seeing more play, it's going to fall closer to 50%. So the average win rate here, the higher it is, the more impressive it is if a deck is seeing more and more play. So the reason for that is because it's most oftentimes playing against itself because it's the most common deck, which always results in like a 50% win rate, right? And that's just sort of how Giratina Darkrai goes, especially this season. The #1 most played deck, 12.5% meta share, 53.31% win rate, 2,996 wins to 2,500 losses. That is actually a really impressive record, especially for the #1 most played deck this season. Let's take a look at an example of a recent Giratina and Darkrai deck. This one was from actually just yesterday, and I think that nothing's really changed. I always pull up Giratina Darkrai decks, but to be fair, they're always kind of the same thing. They don't really change much throughout the season. They sort of get established. People add in maybe like a new card or so, and then it just sort of remains for quite some time throughout the season. But Giratina Darkrai is still really strong. I think most people understand the deck lists. Now let's take a look at the matchup spreads for Giratina and Darkrai, because this is going to be really interesting. And this is what I always say about Giratina Darkrai, is that it's tough because there's nothing in the game that really hard counters it. You can build decks that do hard counter Giratina Darkrai. Specifically, that would be like an Oricorio deck with a bunch of healing and sustain, like Oricorio with Shaman and like Giant Capes and like Guzmas to get rid of the Rocky Helmets. Like, you can build a deck around beating Giratina Darkrai, but none of the most commonly played decks in the format are specifically hard countering Giratina Darkrai, which is why we see none of its matchups here are basically below 40%, which is crazy, and most of them are actually not above 60% either, which again is just absolutely insane. Giratina Darkrai, 41% against Buzzwole, Celesteela, or Buzzwole, any Buzzwole deck, I guess, relatively. I think I combined the archetypes here. 40% against Silvally, Zero Aura, so one of the more common Oricorio decks, and Buzzwole, those are kind of the strong matchups. 65% against Sylveon, Greninja, 53% against Flareon, 56% against Espeon, 44% against Arceus and Tapu Koko. So I guess as we're seeing here, the Oricorio decks really are, I guess, the best way to counter Giratina, but they aren't like super auto-win matchups. 57 against Crobat, 53 against Guzzlord, 47 against Ho-Oh Snorlax, and then 42 against Charizard. So Charizard always has been a pretty good counterplay to Giratina and Darkrai, just because you can take KOs and live hits. Like, that's really all it comes down to. So that's what we're seeing, right? Buzzwole, Oricorio, Charizard, but against Umbreon, against Lugia, against Donphan, really good win rates, 52%, about 50-50 against Silvally, Pichu, and then actually 64% against Arceus Pichu, which is really interesting for sure. And then about a 50% win rate against Flareon. So that's the crazy thing about Giratina Darkrai, is that the matchup spreads are like the opposite of volatile. They're just very balanced. Nothing is super good or super bad. There are some, like, obviously good matchups, like Donphan obviously does well in Umbreon. and against Sylveon Greninja. Like, those are good matchups, but everything else is like pretty close to 50-50. And that's what I think is always really frustrating about Giratina Darkrai, is that you just can't really seem to like hard play around it. It's just gonna like always have a chance because it's so consistent, and it's always gonna do what it wants to do. And whether or not you like your opponent does as well, it just kind of comes down to whether they draw good or not. And that's the crazy part about Giratina Darkrai, man. Just such a consistent deck list, and really impressive, honestly, at this point in the season. The #1 most played deck to be this high of a win rate. Definitely very, very interesting. Right here is Tapu Koko and Arceus. We're going to just sort of breeze through these a little bit because I don't want this video to be too long. Tapu Koko Arceus right here, right? The 50th most played deck, 49th here. Only 21 people have played it, 66 and 58. So this is such a small sample size, but we do know what Arceus and Tapu Koko is. This is Silvally or Ikorio here, the 9th most played deck with a 52.5% win rate. This is going to be Silvally, but without Pichu. Instead, you're playing Zeraora and you're playing one copy of Dawn. This is the sort of Ikorio Silvally deck of previous formats without baby Pokemon, and this is kind of what a lot of people are still playing, but more people I think are moving over to the Pichu version just because it's a bit more consistent. And then next up, we've got the same thing with Arceus, actually, right? So there's sort of these legacy ways to play these decks that don't incorporate the baby Pokemon as the primary. This deck is actually just playing one Pichu, which is funny. But traditionally, like, this deck list without Pichu was categorized as Arceus and Ikorio, but you know, sort of the real Turbo Arceus deck seemingly is the better version to play it because it is actually the #1 most played deck. So this is virtually the same deck just with one Pichu, which I find that to be funny. Limitless sometimes has issues sort of categorizing certain deck lists, but yeah, it's how it goes. You know, Buzzwole Celesteela also, it's the same deal. This is just Buzzwole, but instead of like 2 Pheromosa, you're just playing one, and then you're playing like 1 Kartana. And then Limitless categorizes it differently. This is what we call balanced Buzzwole here on the channel. Also a really good deck. Again, 95% of your games are going to function the same playing a deck list like this as opposed to the 2 Pheromosa version, but theoretically speaking, most people are just playing 2 Pheromosa, and it, I guess, has a higher win rate. So there you go. What do we got next here that could be surprising? Turbo Dark Silvally here, the 21st most played deck, actually does have a really good win rate at 52.5%. I say really good, but really decent. Again, small-ish sample size, 229 to 209. And this is kind of the interesting thing here is like, this is something that I guess just sort of popped up. Like early on in the season, people were playing like the baby Pokemon with Silvally, and then they just threw in 1 Darkrai or 2 Darkrai, and they were like, this is Turbo Aggression, like Darkrai and Turbo Silvally. But the thing is, like, Ikorio just ended up being more useful, so people were like, okay, let's just play 1 copy of Ikorio and 1 Darkrai, but then your overall strategy is just a little bit less consistent, right? So it's like, all right, so if Silvally and Ikorio and Pichu has a higher win rate than you know, Darkrai and Ikorio, then just play no Darkrai and just play 2 Ikorio, right? And both of these decks have a higher win rate than no Ikorio. So what that tells me is that just playing Ikorio ends up being better, even though I guess Darkrai is going to help you in the Espeon matchup. Either way, definitely kind of interesting for sure. Let's finish the video by talking about Turbo Flareon, because if we go here, this is the, I don't know how many this is, but it's the 13th most played deck so far this season. Flareon and Leafeon here is a little bit below an average win rate, but it's seen more play so far this season. But Turbo Flareon is a very interesting deck, right? So 51, almost a 52% win rate, 388 to 353. 134 people have played it. Let's take a look at an example of Turbo Flareon, because this is honestly one of my favorite decks, and we covered it a couple of weeks ago. I actually think it's the best way to play Flareon with Magby, and this is a really cool deck list, and you can play 2 of the Genetic Apex Flareon. This deck gets around the Ikorio decks really easily, which I think is pretty cool, and it's just a really aggressive, fast-paced deck list, and we do have this on the matchup sheet. It's actually all the way at the bottom here. So let's take a look at the win rates and the matchup spreads for Turbo Flareon. So 50% and 55% against Giratina Darkrai and Buzzwole, 2 of the most played decks so far this season, and that is very decent, basically an even matchup spread against the 2. 58% against Silvally and Zeraora, so Turbo Flareon is doing well against the Ikorio decks. 44% against Sylveon and Greninja, probably because the bench sniping aspect of Greninja is probably really strong against the baby Pokemon. But anyway, that's definitely not a great matchup. 52% in the Flareon mirror match, or I guess against the other Flareon deck being Flareon and Leafeon. And then as we see over here, 62% against Espeon. So yes, Turbo Flareon is a deck list that does much better against Espeon than Leafeon and Flareon does, which is definitely really cool. I think a major upside to Turbo Flareon. 62 and 65% here, 65% against Arceus and Tapu Koko. That's a 75% winner, which is crazy. And then a couple bad matchups here, 36 and 29% against the dark decks being Crobat and Guzzlord. Just matchups, I guess, that Turbo Flareon might struggle with. These decks are really aggressive and have a lot of HP, so maybe that kind of comes down to it. The energy discard from Guzzlord is probably really important as well. 67% win rate against Snorlax Ho-Oh, 37% win rate here against Charizard, so it's also going to struggle against Charizard, and then the rest of the other matchup data, we just don't, I guess, have enough information here. But 57% here against Lugia, 59% here against Silvally Pichu, and then only 42% against Arceus and Pichu. So I really like Turbo Flareon. I think that it actually has a bit of a top-heavy matchup spread here. It struggles against a couple of random decks sort of at the middle here, Charizard, Guzzlord, Crobat, but against a lot of the most relevant decks and the most played decks, it actually does have either, an even or winning matchup spread, which I think is definitely really, really cool. So shout out to Turbo Flareon. Anyway, guys, that's it. So that's all of the, I guess, the highest win rate deck so far of the season. I like making this video. It's a little bit maybe hard for some people to follow because we go through so much data. But I always like to make this video because we're just sort of doing our due diligence, right? And we're kind of, talking about the realism of the stats because, it's not everything, right? It's not the number one, I guess, thing to talk about when you're, determining the viability of a deck list, but it is important. And we oftentimes do use data here on the channel because it is kind of the best reference we have to determine the viability of certain decks. And the data might not be sort of as, I guess, obvious as maybe some people think, which is why I kind of wanted to make this video. I also wanted to showcase the matchup chart. So again, this is going to be down in the Discord. Feel free to hop right in, and then you can kind of just view this whenever you want. I'm updating it basically every other week, and I found this to be a very valuable tool in my experience, and I think other people enjoy it as well. So there you go, guys. Were you surprised by anything, by any of the highest win rate decks so far this season? What are some things that, surprised you or didn't surprise you, or, I guess, I don't know, just comment down below. I'd love to hear what you guys think about all of this. I apologize if this was, like, again, hard to read or whatever, but I'm a data guy, so that's what we do here on the channel, right? We crunch the numbers, and I have a good time doing it at least. So anyway, let's get out of here, guys. Hopefully we get the A4A mini set trailer tomorrow. If we do, we will be covering it. And on Friday, we have to talk about our best decks for ranks video to finish off this season. So let's get out of here, guys. Peace out. Have a good one. We'll see you guys later. And yeah. Bye.